Chapter 11. In the beginning, I took a short walk along the shore and came back early. I retired to rest and was soon sleeping soundly in my big bed, made of rough planks and wood. I awoke and heard my uncle talking at a great rate in the next room. I got up immediately and hastened to join him. He was talking in Danish to a very tall man, of strong, well-built frame. This strapping fellow was evidently crowded with unusual strength. He had very large head and innocent, simple-looking face. His pale blue eyes, dreamy as they were, seemed to be full of intelligence. Long hair, which would have been called red even in England, hung down over his athletic shoulders. His movements were full of suppleness, and he scarcely stirred his arms, and seemed to be a man who either disdained or was unacquainted with the language of gestures. Everything about him revealed a temperament of most perfect calmness, not indolent but placid. You felt that he was not one to ask favors, and that he worked when it suited him, and that his philosophy would never be too disturbed or surprised by whatever might happen. I could tell all this by the way the Icelander listened to the torrent of words poured out by his interlocutor. But he stood with his folded arms, motionless, in the face of the multiplied gestures made by my uncle. His head turned from left to right if he wished to give a negative reply, and gently bowed for an affirmative one, but so gently that his long hair scarcely moved. It was economy of motion carried to extremes. Certainly I could never have guessed the man was a hunter. He would never frighten the game that way. It was true, but how could he so much get near it? All was explained when Mr. Fridriksson informed us that he was an eider-duck hunter, a bird whose down is principal wealth of the island. The down is called eider down, and no amount of movement is required to get. Early in the summer, the female, a pretty species of duck, builds her nest among the rocks of the fjords which fringe the entire coast. This nest she lines with the downy feathers off her own breast. Immediately the hunter of the rather traitor comes and takes the nest away, and the poor bird recommences her task only to be robbed again. This repeated until her breast is stripped bare, when the male steps in feathers in his turn. This time she is allowed to lay her eggs in peace, and as coarse, hard plumage of her mate has no commercial value, so the nest is completed. The eggs laid, and the young ones hatched, and the birds left undisturbed till the following year, when the harvest begins again. Now the eider does not choose precipitous crags for her nest, but rather low-lying horizontal rocks for which stretch out into the sea. The Iceland hunter may pursue his calling without disturbing himself much. He was a farmer who neither needed to sow nor cut down his harvest. All he had to do was gather it in. This grave, mythologic, silent parsonage was named Hans Blake. He came out of recommendation to Mr. Fridriksson for guide. His manner strangely contrasted with that of my uncle. However, they soon came to a mutual understanding. Neither of them cared about terms. One was ready to take whatever was offered, the other ready to give whatever he was asked. Never was a bargain more easily settled. The result of the arrangement was that Hans engaged to take us to the village of Strapi, lying on the southern side of the peninsula of Snaefell, at the very foot of the volcano. The distance by land was about 22 miles, and 2 days' journey, my uncle reckoned. But when he found out that the Danish mile were 24,000 feet, he obliged to alter his calculations, taking into account the different roads, allow 7 or 8 days. 4 horses were to be placed at our disposal, to two to carry him and me, and two for our luggage. Hans, according to his habit, would go on foot. He knew this part of the coast perfectly and promised to take us by the shortest route. His engagement with my uncle was not to end with our arrival at Strap-Eye. He was to remain in his service during the whole time of his scientific expeditions. The sum of the 3 Rix a week. It was also expressly agreed, and indeed was a sine qua non of engagement. Not that this is the sum should be paid down every Saturday evening. The departure was fixed for the 16th of June. My uncle wished to pay earnest money on the conclusion of the bargain, but the man refused by pronouncing the single word, "Efter." After, explained my professor for my vacation. "A first-rate fellow," said my uncle as Hans withdrew, "but he has no idea of the marvelous part he has to play in this future. He will go with us then into, yes, Axel, into the center of the earth." He had 48 hours still left before starting, but my great regret they were obliged to be spent in preparations. We had to our wits to work to pack each article to the greatest advantage. Instruments on one side, arms on the other, tools in this parcel, provisions in that, 4 sets in all. The instruments comprised 1. An Eagle centigrade thermometer, graduated up to 150 degrees, which seemed to be either too much or too little. Too much if its surrounding heat it would rise to that, for we should be baked. Too little if it was to measuring the temperature of springs for any matter of state fusion. A manometer for indicating higher atmospheric pressure that of the sea. An ordinary barometer would not have been enough, as atmospheric pressure would increase in proportion to our descent below the surface of the earth. A chronometer by Boisnas June of Geneva, accurately regulated by the meridian of Hamburg. 4. 2 compasses for taking inclinations and declinations. 5. A night glass. 6. 2 Ruhmkorff's apparatus, which, by the means of electric current, give a very portable, safe light. The arms consisted of 2 Purdy Moore's rifles and 2 Colt's revolvers. What did we need arms for? It was not likely we would encounter savages or wild beasts, I thought, but my uncle seemed to consider his arsenal as necessary as instruments. He took special care to lay a stock of gun cotton, which damp could not affect, and explosive force that is superior to the ordinary gunpowder. The tools comprised of 2 pickaxes, 2 spades, a silk rope ladder, 3 iron-tipped sticks, a hatchet, a hammer, a dozen wedges, and iron holdfast, the long knotted ropes. A pretty sized package that made for the latter measured 300 feet. Then there were provisions, but these did not take up much room, though it was comforting to know that we had enough essence of beef and dry biscuits to last us 6 months. The only liquid we took was gin, and absolutely not a drop of water. But we had gourds, and my uncle reckoned on finding springs where we might refill them. However, whatever objections to this I made on the ground of their equality and temperature, or even their absence, was unsuccessful. To complete the exact list of all we took with us, I must mention a portable medicine chest, containing blunt scissors, splints for broken limbs, a piece of unbleached linen tape, bandages and compressors, lint, all terrible-looking things, and in addition to these series of phials containing dextrine, spirits of wine, and drugs suggesting painful possibilities. Lastly, all the necessary articles for Ruhmkorff's apparatus. My uncle did not forget to take a supply of tobacco, powder for hunting, tinder, and a leather belt, which he wore around his waist, and which he carried a sufficient sum of money in gold, silver, and paper. Good boots, made waterproof by solution of India rubber and naphtha. 6 pairs in all were stowed away among the tools. With such an outfit of equipment as ours, there is no reason why we should not go far, said my uncle. The 14th was entirely taken up but with settling of all our different articles. In the evening, we dined at Barn Tramps with the mayor of Reykjavik and Dr. Hylaelton. The principal physician in the country, Mr. Fredrickson, was not among the guests. I afterward heard that he and the governor had different opinion on some question of administration and were no longer on speaking terms. I had no opportunity, therefore, of understanding a word of conversation during this semi-official dinner. I only noticed that my uncle was talking all the time. The next day, the 15th, our preparations were completed. Our host afforded my uncle the liveliest pleasure by presenting him with a map of Iceland, far more perfect than the Henderson. It was the map of Olaf Nicholas Olsen reduced to 1 in 480,000 of the real size of the island, and published by Iceland Literary Society. This was a precious document to a mineralogist. The last evening was spent in close conversation with Mr. Fredrickson, for whom I had felt sympathetic attraction, and this was followed by a troubled, sleepless night. As far, at least, was I concerned. At 5 a.m., the neighing of the 4 horses as they stood pawing below the window made me rise hastily and go down. I found Hans just finishing and loading the horses, almost without stirring. One would say, but he did not work with his uncommon cleverness. My uncle was making a great noise rather than helping. The guide appeared to take no notice of his orders. By 6 a.m., all was ready. We shook hands with Mr. Fredrickson, and my uncle thanked him most heartily for his great hospitality. As for myself, I launched out a concordial farewell in the best Latin I could find. Then we jumped on our saddles, and Mr. Fredrickson repeated with his best adieu and line of Virgil, which seemed to have been made for uncertain travelers on the road like us. Et quacum viam dederit fortuna secumur. Chapter 12. The sky was gloomy when we started, but settled, so we had neither rain nor heat to fear. It was the very weather for tourists. The pleasure of roaming over an unknown country on horseback easily reconciled me to this debut of our enterprise. Indeed, I felt quite in the mood of an excursionist rejoicing in his freedom, and, in full desires and expectations, I began to take my share in the business. Besides, I said to myself, what risk is there? We are to travel through one of the most curious countries in the world, and climb a most remarkable mountain, and, even at the worst, descend through the bottom of an extinct crater, for it is quite evident that all that Secusum did. As to there being any passage out of it right into my heart of the earth, that's where pure imagination. A sheer impossibility, so I make up all my mind and to get all the enjoyment I can out of business, and not to bother about the rest. By the time I had reached this conclusion, I had gone out of Reykjavik. Hans was walking ahead at a rapid, even continuous pace. 2 baggage horses followed him without being led. My uncle and I brought up the rear, and really we did not cut a bad figure on our small but stout steeds. Iceland is one of the largest islands in Europe. It is 14,000 miles in extent and only has a population of 60,000. Geographers have divided it into 4 quarters, and we have crossed in nearly diagonal direction the one called Suvest de Fjorgen, the country of the southwest quarter. After leaving Reykjavik, Hans kept straight along the coast. We went through scanty pastures and tried their best to look green, and never succeeded in being anything but yellow. The rugged peaks of tractite rocks were faintly outlined on misty eastern horizon. At times, a few patches of snow, concentrating the scattered rays of light, glittered brilliantly on the tops of the distant mountains. Certain peaks, bolder than the rest, pierced through the gray clouds and reappeared above the moving matter like rocks out of the sea. Often these change of barren rocks made a sharp turn toward the sea, encroaching on the pasturage, but there was always room enough to pass. Our horses, moreover, instinctively chose the best footing, without once slackening speed. My uncle never had the satisfaction of urging his steed by voice or whip. He could not even get impatient with it. I could not help smiling, though, at seeing such a tall man on such a little horse. His long legs barely cleared the ground, and he looked like a centaur with 6 legs. Good beast, he said. You will see, Axel, that is a more intelligent animal does not exist in the Icelandic horse. Nothing stops him, neither snows, tempests, impassable roads, nor glaciers. He is brave, steady, and sure-footed. He will never make a false step. He never shies. If we ever have to cross a river or fjord, and we shall be sure to meet with them, you will see him, without the least hesitation, plunge into the water as if he were some amphibious animal, and gain the opposite bank. But we must not be rough with him. Leave him with his liberty, and we shall get him on the rate of nearly 30 miles away a day. Oh, I have no doubt we shall, but how about the guide? Oh, I have no concern on that score. Men of his stamp never get the ground without perceiving it. He moves himself too little to get fatigued, and besides, he shall never have my horse at a pinch. I shall soon get the cramp if I have no exercise. I must steady my legs and as well as my arms. We are getting on famously. The country was almost a desert already. Here there was a solitary farmhouse called a bur in Icelandic, or a dwelling constructed of earth and wood and pieces of lava, stood up like a poor beggar by the roadside. These dilapidated-looking huts seemed as if they were asking alms from the passerby, and for 2 pins we have given them a trifle. In this country there are neither roads nor paths, and, slow as vegetation is, travelers come so few and far between that their footsteps are so overgrown. And yet this part of the province, lying so near the capital, was reckoned among the inhabited and cultivated portions of Iceland. What would it be, then, districts more deserted than this desert? We had gone half a mile without seeing as much a farmer at the door of his hut, a rude shepherd tending his flock less wild than himself. Nothing had come in sight but a few cows and sheep wandering as they passed. What, then, must those convulsed regions be, overturned by eruptions, themselves the offspring of volcanic explosions and subterranean commotions? We were doomed to know that in good time, but on consulting Olsen's map, they would be avoided by keeping along the winding coast. In fact, the great plutonic action is specially concentrated in the interior of the island. Then the piled-up rocks in horizontal layers called trap in Scandinavian, trachytes, basalt, tuff, and all volcanic conglomerates, streams of lava, and porphyry in the state of fusion invest the country with supernatural horrors. I am little imagined, however, the spectacle which awaited us on the peninsula of Snæfell, where these fiery materials make a very chaos. 2 hours after leaving Reykjavik, we arrived in the burh of Gufnis, called Aulukra, or principal church. There was nothing remarkable about it. In fact, there was nothing in it but a few houses, scarcely enough to make a German hamlet. Hans were here half an hour. We shared our frugal breakfast and said yes or no to all my uncle's questions, except when we asked where we were to pass the night, and he replied, Gardar. I consulted the map to see where Gardar was, and I found a little town of that name, the banks of Halvesfjord, or 4 miles from Reykjavik. Showed it to my uncle. Only 4 miles, he said. 4 miles out of 22. That's a pretty walk, certainly. He began some remark to the guide about it. But Hans took no notice and resumed his place ahead, so we had to set off again. 3 hours later, still treading a faded grass, we had to go around the Kala Fjord, a shorter and easier route than across the inlet. We soon entered Pingstan, or parish named Eligeberg, the clock of which have struck 12 if the Icelandic churches had been rich enough to possess clocks. But they were like parishioners. They have no clocks and managed to do without them. The horses were baited here, and then we struck into a narrow path between the chain of hills and the sea, which brought us to our next stage, the Aldekirke of Bantar, and a mile further to the Sandborg of Annexia, a chapel of ease on the south shore of Hajvord. It was then 4 p.m. We had gone 4 miles, equal to 24 English miles in this part. The fjord was at least half a mile in breadth. The waves were dashing noisily over the sharp rocks. The inlet had rocky walls on either side, or a rather steep precipice, and crowned with peaks of 2,000 feet high, remarkable for their brown strata separated by beds of reddish tuff. However intelligent our horses might be, I did not augur anything good at the attempting to cross regular arm of the sea on the Black Quadrupled. If they are really as intelligent as they are said to be, I thought to myself, they won't try to pass it. Anyway, I'll be intelligent enough for them. But my uncle would not wait. He spurred right onto the shore. His horse snuffed the wind and stopped short. My uncle, who had an instinct to, urged forward, and again the animal refused, and shook his head. Then come oaths and smart lashes with a whip, but the beast only quickly tried to fling his rider. At last, the little horses bent his knees and managed to slip out under the professor's legs, leaving him standing upright on 2 boulders, like a colossus of Rhodes. "The confounded brute!" exclaimed the horseman, suddenly transformed into pedestrian, much ashamed as the cavalry officer would be degraded to a foot soldier. "Barja!" said the guide, touching his shoulder. "What? A boat?" "Der! Hi!" replied Hans, pointing to a boat. "Yes," I exclaimed. "I see a boat yonder. Why didn't you say so before? Let us go to it, then." "Tividibin." "What does he say?" "The tide," replied my uncle, translating the Danish word. "No doubt he means we must wait for the tide." "Forbidja," said my uncle. "Ja," replied Hans. My uncle stamped his foot, and the horses went on their boat. I quite understood the necessity of waiting for a particular state of the tide to undertake the crossing of the fjord, but when the sea was at the flood, for the flux and reflux are not sensibly felt, and there was no risk of the boat being dragged to the bottom or out to the broad ocean. The favorable moment did not arrive till 6 in the evening. Then my uncle, myself, the guide, 2 ferrymen, and the 4 horses took our places on a somewhat frail raft. Accustomed I was to the streamers on the Elbe, the boatman's oars seemed to me a very miserable species of propeller. It took us more than an hour to get over, but the passage was made without any accident. Half an hour afterwards, we reached Aldekirke of Gardar. Chapter 13. It should have been quite dark, for it was night, but under the 56th parallel, the nocturnal light of the polar regions was not astonishing. During the months of June and July, the sun never sets. The temperature, however, got much lower. I was cold. I was worse still, very hungry. Welcome indeed was the boar, which hospitality was opened its door to receive us. It was only the peasant's hut, but in point of hospitality equal to a king's palace. The master of it came to meet us with an outstretched hand, and without further ceremony beckoned us to follow him. Literally to follow him, for to accompany him would have been impossible. A long, narrow, dark passage led into the dwelling, which was built of roughly squared planks. All the rooms opened into this passage. These were 4 in number: the kitchen and the weaving shop, the badstrofa, or sleeping room for the family, and best of all, a visitor's room. My uncle, whose height had not been considered in building the house, of course knocked his head 3 or 4 times against the projecting beams of the ceiling. We were conducted to our room, a large room with an earth floor well beaten down, lighted by a window, the panes of which were formed by of sheep's bladder, none too transparent. The bed consisted of dry fodder thrown into 2 wooden frames, painted red and ornamented with sentences in Icelandic. I did not expect such comfort. The only drawback was the unpleasant smell of dried fish, hung beef, and sour milk, which pervaded the house. When we had doffed off our traveling attire, we had heard a voice of our host inviting us into the kitchen, the only place where there was a fire, even in the coldest of weather. My uncle had lost no time obeying the friendly summons, and I followed. The fireplace of the kitchen was the ancient fashion, the hearth in the center of the room, and the old hole in the roof above it, to let the smoke out. The kitchen also served for a dining room. On our entrance, the host, as if had not seen us, greeted us with the word "Salvent virtur," which means "be happy," and kissed us on the cheek. Then his wife pronounced the same words, followed by the same ceremonial, and afterward they both laid their right hand on their heart and bowed profoundly. I hasten to say that this Icelandic woman was the mother of 19 children, big and little, buzzing around the room in the midst of the dense smoke which filled it. Every instant some little fair head and rather melancholy face would peep out the clouds constantly curling up from the hearth. One would have said they were a band of angels, though their faces would have been better for soap and water. My uncle and I were very kind to this brood of youngsters, so before long we had 3 or 4 of the little monkeys on our shoulders, as many on our knees, and the rest among our legs. Those who could speak repeated "Salvertu" in every imaginable tone, and those who could not shrieked their loudest to make up for it. This concert was interrupted by a summons to the repast. Our hunter just at this moment came back after seeing that the horses were provided with food. That is to say, we had, by the way of economy, turned them out on the field to find for ourselves what moss they could on the rocks, and in a few innutritious seaweeds, and they would return of their accord in the morning to resume their labors. "Salvertu," said Hans. Then quietly, automatically, and impatiently, he kissed the host and hostess and the 19 children. This performance over, we sat down to the table, 24 in number, and consequently we were literally one on top of another. We, the most favored of us, had at least 2 of the small fry on our knees. But the appearance of the soup soon made silence in a little word, and the taciturnity which was natural even among the gamins of Iceland resumed its way. The host assisted us to the soup made of lichen, and not at all unpleasant, and this was followed by a huge piece of dried swimming and butter, and that had been kept 20 years, and of course this was perfectly rancid, a qualification which made it greatly preferable to fresh butter, according to the gastronomical's idea of Iceland. With this, we had skyr, a sort of clotted milk, and biscuits and the juice of juniper berries. Our beverage was what whey mixed with water, called blonda in this country. I really am no judge of merits of this singular diet, for I was enormously hungry, and at the dessert I ate to the very last mouthful plate of thick buckwheat porridge. The moment of the meal was over. The children disappeared, and the grown-up folks gathered round the hearth, where not only peat was burning, but winds, cow dung, and fish bones. After this pinch of heat, the different groups retired to their respective rooms. According to custom, our hostess offered to pull up our stockings and trousers. But after the most polite refusal on our part, she left us, and I was at last able to bury myself in my bed of moss. At 5 a.m, we bade the Icelandic peasant farewell, after persuading him with difficulty to take a fair remuneration, and Hans gave the signal to start. About 100 steps from Gardar, the soil began to change its aspect. The ground became boggy and less favorable to our progress. On the right, the chain of mountains extended indefinitely, like an immense system of natural fortifications, the counterscarp of which we were following. Often we came to the streams, which we had to ford carefully to prevent our baggage from getting wet, if possible. The solitude deepened as we advanced, but now and again the shadow of a human being seemed to flee away in the distance as we approached. If a sudden turn brought us unexpectedly one near of these specters, I fell back into disgust at the sight of a swollen head and shining scalp destitute of hair, and loathsome sores visible through the tattered rags that covered them. The poor wretch would not approach us, nor hold out his misshapen hand, but dart away as fast as his legs could carry him. Though Hans would always manage to greet him with the usual salutation, "Salve tu." "Spectux," he said. "A le pere," said my uncle. A mere word at the repulsive effect. This dreadful disease of leprosy is pretty common in Iceland. It is not contagious, but hereditary, and consequently marriage is forbidden to poor creatures. Such apparitions as these were not calculated to enliven the landscape, which became more gloomy at every step. The last tufts of grass had disappeared. Not a tree was to be seen, except a few dwarf birches, no higher than brushwood, not an animal, except a few horses, some which their owner could not feed, and had turned out to live as best they could. Sometimes we would descry a hawk poising herself in the gray clouds, then flying away to the south. Such a dreary region made me melancholy, and my thoughts began to revert my native country. Before long, we had crossed several small, unimportant fjords, and then a wide gulf. The tide had just then. We got over without delay and reached the hamlet after Nass, after 1 mile beyond. In the evening, after having forded 2 rivers, which rich in trout and pike, and the Alpha and the Hetta, we were obliged to pass the night in a deserted building, worthy of being haunted by all the hobgoblins of Scandinavia. Jack Frost had certainly chosen it for his own abode, and he played with us pranks all night. Nothing unusual occurred the next day. There was still the same boggy soil, the same uniformity and dreary outlook. By the evening we had gone half our journey, and we had spent the night in the annexia of Crowsbolt. Of the 19th of June, for about a mile, we walked over a stream of hardened lava. This ground is called Hraun in the country. The furrowed surface of the lava presented the appearance of cables, sometimes stretched out long, sometimes coiled up. An immense torrent of this same hardened material ran down from the neighboring mountains, which were extinct volcanoes, but the ruins round it had arrested their former power. Here and there, jets of steam were still visible, ensuing from hot springs beneath the surface. We had no time to observe these phenomena, but we go on steadily. Soon the boggy soil appeared afresh, interested by little lakes. but we were now pursuing a westerly direction. In fact, we had gone round the great bay of Faxa, and the white peaks of Snawfell stood up against the clouds less than 5 miles. The horses held out well, undeterred by the difficulties of the soil. For my own part, I began to be very tired. My uncle was firm and upright as on the next day. I could not but admire him, even in comparison with the hunter, who looked on our journey as a mere promenade. On the Saturday, June 20th, at 6 p.m., we reached Boudir, a village on the seashore. Here the guide claimed his promised wage, and my uncle paid him. It was Hans' family, that is his uncle and his cousins, who had offered us hospitality. We were kindly received by them, and without abusing the hospitality of those good people, I would willingly have stayed there a little to recruit myself after our fatigues. But my uncle, who had no need to recruit himself, would not hear it, and the next morning we had to remount our steeds. The soil was painfully affected by the victory of the mountain, the granite foundations of which appeared above the ground like the roots of an oak. We went round the immense base of the volcano, the professor devouring all the time with his eyes, gesticulating, apparently defying the giant, and saying, There stands the giant I am going to conquer." At last, after 4 hours of walking, the horses stopped of their own will before the priest's house in Strapi. Chapter 14. Stampai is a village composed of about 30 huts built of lava and lying in the sunlight reflected by the volcano. It extends along a small fjord, enclosed in a ballistic wall, which has the strangest effect. Basalt, as is well known, is a brown rock of igneous origin. It affects regular forms, the disposition of which is often surprising. Here nature proceeds geometrically, working after the manner of men with square and compass and plummet. Through everywhere else, her art is seen in large masses, thrown down in disorder, in unfinished cones, in perfect pyramids with the most fantastic succession of lines, as if to form an example of regularity and in advance of the very easiest attachments. She has created a severe order which has never been surpassed by the splendors of Babylon and the marvels of Greece. I had heard of the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, in Fingal's Cave and the Hebrides, but I had never seen a ballistic formation. This phenomenon I was to witness at Stampai in all its beauty. The wall to the fjord, like all the coast of the peninsula, is composed of a succession of vertical columns 30 feet high. These straight shafts of perfect proportions supported an architrave, were made of horizontal columns, the overhanging portion of which formed a semi-arc over the sea. At certain intervals under this natural shelter, there were vaulted openings of admirable design, through which the caves came dashing and foaming. Fragments of basalt, torn away by the fury of the ocean, lay among the ground like the ruins of an ancient temple. Ruins which never grew old, or over which ages passed without leaving an imprint behind them. This was the last stage of our terrestrial journey. Hans had proved himself an intelligent guide, and it was a comfort to think he was not going to leave us here. On arriving at the door of the rector's house, just a low cabin like his neighbors, neither grander nor more comfortable, I saw a man engaged in shoeing in a horse, hammering in hand and leather apron around him. "Salverta," said the hunter. "Goddag," replied the blacksmith in pure Danish. "Kjolshehord," said Hans, turning to my uncle. "The rector," said my uncle. "Axel, appears this good man has a rector." Meantime, our guide was explaining about us to the Kjolshehord, who left us off to his work, and gave a sort of cry, no doubt in common use among horses and jockeys. The tall, vixenish-like looking shrew instantly made her appearance. If she did not measure 6 feet high, she would certainly was not much less. I was afraid she would for me the Icelandic kiss, but I had not have alarmed myself, for her manner was too ungracious for any such politeness. The visitor's room to which she conducted us to be the worst in the house, being close-smelling, dirty, and narrow. However, we were obliged to put up with it. The rector was clearly not given to ancient hospitality. Before the day was over, I saw we had to do with the blacksmith, a fisherman, a hunter, carpenter, and not all with a minister of Christ. True, we came in on weekday, but perhaps he was a better man on Sundays. I don't want to say anything bad about these poor priests, who, after all, are miserably off. The sum they receive from the Danish government is ridiculously small, and they have besides is the fourth part of the tithe, which does not amount to more than 60 marks, about £4, consequently. They are obliged to work but for a living. But fishing and hunting and shoeing horses gives a man at least a tune and habits and manners of fishermen and hunters and farers and such like people. I found at night that even sobriety could not be reckoned among his virtues. My uncle quickly understood his man. Instead of good and honorable man of learning, this was a coarse, lumpish peasant. He therefore resolved to commence his great expedition with the least possible delay, and to get out of this inhospitable parsonage. The utter disregard of his fatigue, he determined to go and spend a few days in the mountain. The very next morning, our preparations began. Hans hired 3 Icelanders to take the place of the horses and carry our luggage, but it was distinctly understood that as soon as they had deposited it in the crater, they were going to turn and go back, and leave us to do the best we could. My uncle took this opportunity of apprising Hans of his intention to explore the volcano to its farthest limits. Hans simply nodded. To go there, or anywhere else, into the bowels of the earth, or in the surface, was all alike to him. For myself, hitherto I had been amused by the incidents of the journey, and somewhat forgetful of the future. But now my terrors returned in full force. But what was to be done? If I wished to resist Professor Lindenrock, it was at Hamburg I should have done it, not in Snaefell. One thought especially tormented me, one which might appall stouter nerves than mine. I said to myself, we are going to ascend to Snaefell. That's well enough. We are going to visit the crater. Well enough, too. Others have done that, and they came up alive. But that is not all. If there should actually be a passage into the bowels of the earth, and that unlucky Sakuzum spoke truth, we shall go and lose ourselves to the subterranean windings of the volcano. But what is there to prove that Snaefell is extinct? Who will guarantee that an eruption is not preparing to break out? Because the monster has been sleeping since 1229, does it follow that he will never wake up again? And if he does wake up, what will become for us? This was worth thinking about. I did not think about it. I could not sleep without dreaming of eruptions, and I must say I did not feel inclined to play a part of Scotia. At last I could not bear myself any longer, and resolved to submit the case to my uncle with much tact as possible, and under the form of an impossible hypothesis. I went in quest of him, and told him my fears, and then drew back to let his first outburst of passion pass over. But all he said was, I have been thinking of it. What could he mean? Was he really going to listen to the voice of reason? Could he be going to suspend the project? It is too good to be true. After a few minutes of silence, which I did not venture to interrupt, he repeated again, I was thinking of it. Ever since we arrived here at Stapai, my mind has been occupied with the grave question that you have just submitted me, for it would not do for us to be imprudent. No, indeed, I said emphatically. For 600 years, Snaefell has been silent, but he still may speak. Still, eruptions are always preceded by well-known phenomena. I have been therefore interrogating the inhabitants on this district of the subject. I have examined the ground, and I am in position to say there will be no eruption. I was amazed at this declaration, and could make no reply. Do you doubt what I tell you? Resumed my uncle. Well, come with me. I obeyed mechanically. The professor took a direct course away from the sun by going through the opening into the basaltic wall. Soon we were in the open country. If the word can apply an immense heap of volcanic matter, the whole region seemed to have been overwhelmed with a flood of enormous fragments of trap, basalt, granite, and all the Praxian rocks. Here and there I could see puffs of white vapor rising in the air. These were called by the Icelanders reykjur, and issue from thermal springs, which, by their violence, indicate the volcanic activity of the soil. This seemed to justify my fears, but I fell from the clouds when my uncle went on to say, "You see all the smoke, Axel? Well, they prove that we have nothing to fear from the fury of the volcano." "What an idea!" I exclaimed. "Remember this," continued the professor. "At the approach of an eruption, these vapors redouble their activity, but disappear entirely while the phenomenon lasts, for the electric fluids being relieved from pressure, escape by the crater instead of finding their way out through the cracks in the ground. Since, then, these vapors are now in the usual state, there is no increase of energy, and so that the wind and rain had not given way to a heavy dead calm, you may be sure no eruption is at hand. But enough. When science has spoken, it is for us to hold our peace." I went back to the parsonage, very crestfallen. My uncle had vanquished me by scientific arguments. One hope, however, still remained, and that was that, on our reaching the bottom of the crater, we shall find no passage, in spite of all secusum in the world. I passed the night in all the miseries of nightmare. I was in the midst of a volcano, in the depths of the earth. I felt myself hurled into the planetary spaces, in form of ejected rock. The next day, the 22nd of June, Hans was ready, awaiting us, with his companions bearing provisions, tools, and instruments. 2 stout sticks, tipped with iron, 2 rifles, 2 shell belts were reserved for my uncle and myself. Hans, like a wise man, had added our baggage a leather bottle filled with water, which, with our gourds, would be sufficient to supply for a week. It was 9 a.m. The rector and his tall shrew at the door of the parsonage, doubtless to bid us farewell. But their adieu took the shape of a tremendous bill. They charged us for everything, even the air we breathed, and that was polluted enough. I can vouch for it. This worthy couple fleeced us like any Swiss hotel keeper, and made us pay a good price for their make-believe hospitality. My uncle settled the account, however, without any higgling. A man who is just about to start the center of the earth does not care about a few rix dollars. The matter arranged, Hans gave a signal for starting, and a few minutes afterwards we left Strapi. Chapter 15. Snaefell is 5,000 feet high. Its double cone terminates a stratigraphic belt, which stands out from the mountain system of the island. From our starting point, we could not see its 2 peaks outlined against the gray clouds. I could only see an enormous cap of snow coming down low over the giant's forehead. We walked in file, preceded by the hunter, who was climbing by such narrow paths that 2 could not go abreast. All conversation was therefore nearly impossible. Beyond the basaltic wall of the Friard at Strapi, the ground was herbaceous, fibrous peat, remains of the ancient vegetation of all the bogs on the peninsula. The quantity was underworked, combustible was enough to warm all the people in Iceland for a century. This vast turf pit measured in certain ravines 70 feet deep, and presented successive layers of carbonized detritus separated by sheets of terpenous pumice. As a true nephew of Professor Lindenbrock, notwithstanding my mental preoccupation, I was interested in observing the mineralogical curiosities displayed in a vast cabinet of natural history, and at the same time was going over in my head the whole geological history of Iceland. This most curious island has evidently risen from the depths of the sea at a comparatively recent approach. Perhaps it may even be still rising by an insensible motion. If that be so, its origin can only be attributed to subterranean fires. And in this case, Humphrey Davy's theory and Sakuzum's document, and my uncle's speculations, too, all vanish in a smoke. This hypothesis made me carefully examine the nature of the soil. I could soon account for the successive phenomena which attended its formation. Iceland, being wholly destitute of alluvial soil, is entirely composed of volcanic tufa, that is, a conglomeration of stones and rocks and a porous texture. Prior to the existence of volcanoes, it was composed of trappan rock, slowly upheaved from the sea by the central forces. Interior fires had not yet burst forth. But at a subsequent period, a large fissure appeared running in the diagonal direction from the southwest to northeast, by which the trachyte gradually forced its way out. This phenomenon was not attended with any violence, but the issue was enormous, and fused matter thrown up from the bowels of the earth spread slowly in vast sheets or rounded protuberances. To this approach, the feldspars, syenites, and porphyries belong. But thanks to this outflow, the thickness of the island increased considerably, and all the consequence its powers of resistance. It can be imagined what quantities of electric fluids had accumulated within its bosom, with no channel of escape presented itself after the trachytic crust had cooled and hardened. We came when a time when the mechanical force of these gases became such that they upheaved the heavy crust, and made themselves tall chimneys. The upheaval of the crust formed the volcanoes, and then the crater suddenly opened the summit. To the eruptive phenomena succeeded the volcanic, by the newly created openings to the basaltic ejections first escaped, of which the plain we were just crossing presented the most wonderful specimens. We were walking over gray walks, which had cooled into hexagonal prisms. In the distance, a great number of tractuned cones were visible, each of which had formerly been a mouth of fire. After the basaltic eruption, the volcano, which increased in force by the extinction of other craters, made a passage for lavas and for tufas, viz., ashes, and scoria, long streams of which I could see on the mountainsides, hanging down like a flowing hair. Such was the succession of phenomena which produced Iceland, all proceeding from the internal fire, and to suppose that the mass within was still not in a state of fusion was folly. And surely, to pretend and to try and reach the center of the globe was the very climax of folly. I reassured myself, therefore, about the issue of this enterprise, even while we were on our way to the assault of Snæfell. The route became more and more difficult. The ground was rising, the loose masses of rock trembled, and the utmost care was needed to prevent the dangerous falls. Hans walked on as quietly as if he were on level ground. At times he would disappear behind great blocks, and for a moment we lost sight of him. Then a sharp whistle told us the direction in which to follow him. Often, too, he stopped, picked up some fragments of rock, and rearranged them in recognizable manner, making landmarks in this way all along the road, to show us the route back, a good precaution on his part, though future events rendered it useless. 3 hours of fatiguing walking had only brought us to the base of the mountain. There Hans made a signal to stop, and a hasty breakfast was shared among us. My uncle took 2 mouthfuls at a time, to dispatch it in the quicker, But this halt was not only for breakfast, but for rest, and Hans did not make a start until 1 hour had elapsed. 3 Icelanders, as a taciturn as their comrade, never uttered a syllable, and munched their way up with solemn gravity. Now the steep ascent of Snæfell commenced. His snowy summit, by an optical illusion common enough in the mountains, seemed very near. And yet, what long hours it took to reach it! Above all, what a toil! The stones, not being cemented by any earth, nor adhering together by any roots of herbage, rolled away under our feet, and rushed down the plain with the speed of an avalanche. In certain places, the sides of the mountain formed an angle of 36 degrees, at least with the horizon. It was impossible to climb them, and these stony cliffs had to be rounded, which was no easy matter. We had to assist each other with our sticks. I must say that my uncle kept as close to me as possible. He never let me out of his sight, and many a time his arm was powerful enough to support. He himself certainly had some inner sense of equilibrium, for he never stumbled. The Icelanders, in spite of their loads, climbed with the agility of mountaineers. To look at the height of Snæfell, it seemed impossible to reach the summit. But after an hour's fatigue and athletic exercise, a sort of staircase suddenly appeared in the midst of the vast carpet of snow lying on the croup of the volcano, and this greatly simplified our ascent. It was formed of one of those torrents of stones ejected by the eruption, and which the Icelanders called stinna. If this torrent had not been arrested in its fall by the formation of the mountaineers, it would have been dashed down into the sea, and new islands would have been the result. As it was, it did us a good service. The steepness increased, but these stone steps help us to climb up easily. And so rapidly, then, I stopped for a moment behind the rest. I perceived them already so diminished by size and by distance that their appearance was microscopic. But at 7 in the evening, we had gone up the 2,000 steps of stair, and risen above an extinct cone of mountain stones, of sort of bed which the actual cone of the crater rested. The sea stretched below us 3,200 feet, and we passed the limit of the perpetual snow, which, on account of the humidity of the climate, is rather lower in Iceland. It was bitterly cold. The wind blew violently. I was exhausted. The professor saw my legs and refused to carry me, and, in spite of his impatience, he determined to stop. He made a sign to the hunter to that effect, but Hans shook his head and said, "Often for. We must go higher, it seems," said my uncle, and asked the reason. "Mistur," replied the guide. "Ja, mistur," replied one of the Icelanders in a terrified tone. "What does the man mean?" I asked uneasily. "Look," replied my uncle. I gazed down below. An immense column of pulverized pumice, sand, and dust was rising, whirling around like a water spout. The wind was driving it on the side of Snæfell, and to which we were clinging. The thick curtain across the sun projected a great shadow on the mountain. Should this waterspout-like column bend over, it would inevitably catch us in a whirl. This phenomenon, not uncommon when the wind blows from the glaciers, is called Icelandic mistur. "His stake! His stake!" cried our guide. Though I was acquainted with Danish, I understood we were to follow Hans as quickly as possible. He began to round the cone of the crater, but diagonally to make the task easier. Before long, the huge column fell on the mountain, which trembled at the shock. The loose stones caught up with the circling eddies flew off in a shower as during an eruption. Fortunately, we had gained the opposite side and were in safety. But without precaution on the part of our guide, our mangled bodies reduced to dust. it would have been carried away far into the distance and considered as the product of some unknown meteor. Hans did not think it prudent to pass the night on the sides of the cone. We did not continue our zigzag ascent. The 15,000 feet remaining took us nearly 5 hours to climb. The circuitous windings, the diagonal and counter marches measured 3 leagues, I am sure. I was dead beat, sinking with cold and hunger. The somewhat rarefied atmosphere scarcely allowed my lungs to full play, but at length, at 11 p.m., in the dead of the night, the summit of Snaefell was reached, and before seeking shelter in the crater, I had time to see the midnight sun at its lowest point, gliding the sleeping island at my feet with his pale rays.